Recording in progress.
Good afternoon, good morning, good evening, salam, wherever you're watching us from. Welcome to MACFEST 2025, to the Arabic travel writing with Professor Daniel Newman and Shamim Chowdhury as the host. Welcome everybody. Please let us know in the chat where you're watching us from. We're sitting in France, in the UK, and we're gonna say hello to you in the chat. So let's keep the conversation going today. If you have any questions or any thoughts you'd like to share with us, please put them in the chat or in the Q&A portal. We will pick them up and we'll try to... Oh, hello from Illinois, welcome. From Italy, welcome to, from France, from Jakarta, amazing. Okay, so back to our host, Shamim Chowdhury. You might remember Shamim from our one of our previous events. She's a journalist and a writer with over 20 years experience. And she's been working as a foreign correspondent. She covered wars in Syria, Iraq, and Ukraine, as well as the refugee crisis, natural disasters, elections from all over the world. And she's also a writer, and she's written for publications including The Independent, Middle East Eye, NPR, Al Jazeera English, and others. And she also mentioned that she's a little bit of a cook, so she's just the perfect person to host today's webinar. Over to you, Shamim.
Thank you, Katarzyna, for the lovely introduction, as usual. Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening to everyone joining us from all over the world. Assalamu alaikum and welcome to MACFEST 2025. Now, those of you who have attended MACFEST before, you'll know that it's an internationally acclaimed, multi-award winning 6-month-long celebration of Muslim art and culture. Some of the events are held in venues in the northwest of England, but there are also loads of events that are streamed online to a global audience. For those of you joining us for the first time, welcome. We're delighted to have you with us. Now, a little bit about the festival. It showcases some of the most talented creatives from all across the Muslim world. We're talking about artists, musicians, historians, literary experts, photographers, and much, much more. This year alone, there are 80 events taking part. It goes on all the way through to July. Some of them are in person and others, like this one, are online. So we really hope that you will explore more and attend some of the other sessions. Now, as Katarzyna has said, my name is Shamim Chowdhury. I'm a journalist with a background in TV, print and radio, and I am delighted to be hosting this event for the next hour and a half. I'm particularly excited to be joined by Professor Daniel Newman, who is the Chair of Arabic Studies at the University of Durham. Now, his research interests include Arabic travel literature, 19th century Arab reform movements, Islamic medicine, and medieval Arab culinary history. So we're going to be hearing loads about that today. And I'm a foodie, no doubt many of you who have tuned in are too. So I think it's going to be a really, really interesting session. A little bit more about Daniel. He's the author of the best-selling book, An Imam in Paris, an account of a stay in France by an Egyptian cleric. He was also the co-recipient of the World Award of the President of the Republic of Tunisia for Islamic Studies for the book entitled Muslim Women in Law and Society. His book, The Sultan's Feast, a 15th century cookbook, received the Gourmand World Cookbook Award in 2021. So a very multi-talented person who we are very privileged to have with us today. And just a word about his most recent book. It is the Exiles Cookbook, Medieval Gastronomic Treasures from Al-Andalus and North Africa. Now, he's got a blog, and I've already put the details of that in the chat, and I will keep doing so throughout this session. Do take a look, and you'll be able to get a real sense of just how accomplished Daniel is. Not only that, there's also an Instagram page where he shares his passion for bringing medieval Arab dishes to life. He actually recreates these recipes. And I'll put that link in the chat as well. It's already there, in fact, but I will keep putting it in there. So do take a look at that, and you might want to try out some of those recipes yourself. And I'll also put his university bio in the chat, so that will give you a sense of all of his academic work. Now, the way today's session is going to work is that we have until 3:30 UK time, so we have about an hour and a half, and Daniel will be talking about narrating the unknown, Arabic travel literature. But of course, he'll be incorporating a lot of food in there as well, which is what we really want to hear about, as well as everything else. He's going to be exploring the tradition of travel, the rich tradition of travel in Islamic culture, which is actually grounded in both the Qur'an and the hadith, which both emphasize the pursuit of knowledge as a duty for all Muslims. Now, Daniel's going to talk for about an hour or so, maybe slightly less, slightly more. And after that, we really want to hear your questions. What makes these sessions so great is that they're very interactive, and that's where we get a lot of the energy from. So please don't be shy. Please put your questions in, and once Daniel has finished his talk, I will try to get through as many of those as I can. Even if you don't have a question, just drop us a line to say hello. Tell us where you are in the world. I know we already have people from Indonesia and Italy, so do let us know. I'm in London. Daniel is in Durham, which is in the north of England, and Katarzyna is in France. So already we have a global audience. So do let us know. And as I say, I will make sure that I try to get through as many of those as I can. Now, without any further ado, let's get into it. Daniel, it's an absolute pleasure to be speaking to you today. Thank you so much for joining us. Welcome, and over to you.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Shamim, for this wonderful, wonderful introduction. And yes, as you said, I'm a bit of a regular. I consider myself to be part of the MACFEST family. I'm an old hand now, and it's always a pleasure and an honor to take part in what I believe to be truly a magnificent, and as you pointed out in the beginning of your introduction, a much needed event in these times. So today I'll be talking about travel literature and cultural discovery. If I can have the PowerPoint up, please. Or is that already visible to everybody? Okay, thank you very much. So we're going to talk about an extremely vibrant and prolific genre in Arabic literature, but it will also offer a lens through which to view perceptions of the other, intertwined, of course, with issues of identity and belonging. And hopefully we shall also dispel the persistent and also persistently wrong myth that in medieval times, the Muslim world was insular and xenophobic. In fact, in more ways than one, this is a projection of contemporary prejudice, as nothing, as we hopefully will see, could be further from the truth and reality. It was, in fact, an extremely mobile and open culture, inquisitive about the world as a whole, far beyond the Muslim community, the Ummah, and it very much included an interest in the non-Muslim world. If we could go on to slide 2, please. Now, Islam has always looked very favorably upon the quest for knowledge. And in addition to being a way of life for the nomadic population of the Arabian Peninsula, travel was linked to religion in a number of ways. Both the Qur'an and hadith stress the importance of knowledge, with travel in pursuit of it, knowledge incidentally in Arabic here is ilm, being a duty for all Muslims. There's one very famous hadith that says that believers are enjoined to seek knowledge even if it is in China. And this is very apposite to our talk, as will become clear in a couple of minutes. Travel was also said to be a duty since it was a way for the believer to observe and explore creation, its wonders, and of course the might of God. Muslim scholars, excuse me, were stimulated to travel and literally and figuratively broaden their horizons, with the ultimate goal being knowledge, especially that acquired under famous scholars. At the same time, education wasn't really an end in itself, but a means towards achieving what in Arabic is known as taqwa, pious conduct, as prescribed, of course, by the Prophet. Travel in pursuit of knowledge and education remained an integral part of Muslim intellectual tradition and the lives of many scholars. One phenomenon which combined travel and taqwa, of course, was the pilgrimage, and its roots coincided with cross-border trading routes. The Hajj considerably boosted commerce in the main trading centers along the way. And well before the dawn of Islam, the inhabitants of the Arabian Peninsula were highly active in cross-border trade and thus had regular contacts with other peoples, societies, cultures, and religions. The area was a vital hub in a network of trading routes between East Africa, India, and China, and the Mediterranean, of course, through which the Greeks, Romans, and various Slav peoples got many of their goods. Arab traders also controlled the trade in a much coveted commodity found primarily in the southern part of the peninsula, incense. Demand for incense led to the creation of new trade routes, and then there was, of course, the Silk Road and the spice route. Travel literature was an offshoot of geographical literature and is often grouped together with this genre, which is one of the oldest. Many of the geographers were in fact travelers whose writings were based on first-hand experience. The earliest works of general geography grew primarily out of a very practical need to administer the ever-expanding Muslim empire. The earliest literature can be described as mathematical geography and cartography and included mainly geographical tables without any real narrative. The most famous representative here is a scholar by the name of al-Khwarizmi. We're now in the middle of the 9th century, a famous scholar whose name, of course, gave us the English word algorithm. Geographical manuals, on the other hand, were compiled mainly for practical and administrative purposes, for instance, for the postal service. Apart from the topography of regions, towns, and so on, the distances between them, there's ample detail on state revenue and taxation and on major trading routes of the day. It also affords great detail, incidentally, on contacts with non-Muslim territories, as well as the earliest descriptions of Rome in Arabic literature. The classical school of descriptive geography, which emerged in the 10th century, is that of the traveler geography. And one name merits mention here, that, of course, of the great Sharif al-Idrisi, whose book was completed in Palermo, Sicily in 1154. It was commissioned by his patron, Roger II, the Norman king of Sicily, who was interested in finding regions of interest. And it's difficult to overstate the importance of this work, which was a compilation of knowledge at the time about the known world and also contained 70 maps. It was incidentally also the first Arab or Arabic geographical work to receive attention in Europe when an abridgment was printed at the Rome-based Medici Press in 1592. A partial Latin translation occurred shortly afterwards. Now, in addition to a geographical worldview, where geographers would divide the world in climates and zones, there was also one determined by religion, with the Dar al-Islam, the house of Islam, so the area where the Ummah was, being contrasted with the non-Muslim Dar al-Harb, the house of war, or the Dar al-Kufr, the house of unbelief. Now, in many respects, geographical literature defies any simple classification, as it was often a hybrid, incorporating elements of history, ethnography, anthropology, mythology, and later on even cosmography. The importance of personal observation among Muslim scholars, or the primacy of the eye over the ear, as it has been called, was a principle established by jurists that was fully implemented by some geographers, who stressed the need for true geographical knowledge to draw its substance first and foremost from the geographer's own visual experience. The more a geographer traveled, the greater and the surer was his grasp of the Muslim community, the Ummah. At the same time, authors do not always distinguish between what they themselves saw and what they borrowed and adapted from other sources. Others had a very modern approach and set about questioning people about their country, the towns they lived in or had visited, and then verified it with knowledgeable people. So multiple layers of verification to ensure that the information they were going to write down was as accurate as possible. So it was, again, finding people who had witnessed the areas that they talked about, the things that occurred in those areas firsthand, or at least claimed to have done so. The two sometimes, of course, didn't always match. The literature resulted in a body of considerable geographical knowledge. And here in the next slide, we have some examples of that. So here we have a wonderful map. It's a world map which dates to the 10th century, and it was drawn by a Persian scholar, al-Istakhri. Incidentally, the reason I use the word Arabic rather than Arab in many cases is because we're talking about a literature written in Arabic, irrespective of the ethnic origin of its authors. And so here al-Istakhri was a Persian, yet he wrote in Arabic. And so this world map, apart from being simply a work of art, I think it's such a beautiful drawing. What is interesting here, we can't go into too much detail, but for the time being, suffice it to say that in the upper left-hand corner, we have the south, the lower right-hand corner, the north, lower left, east, and upper right, the west. So the map is upside down, if you will, at least compared to later maps. We could also argue that our maps are upside down, but that's another issue. If I can have the next slide, please. And this is a wonderful example of the advances in cartography at the time. This is probably the oldest rectangular world map. The others tend to be round, the ones preceding it for sure, and even the ones, many of the ones made after them, were round with the so-called encompassing ocean being the encircling bit. But so this one is the oldest rectangular world map. Again, a wonderful drawing. For those who are interested in this particular map, I can recommend the wonderful edition that was prepared by Savage Smith and Rappaport in 2014. If I can have the next slide, please. I think we missed one. Yes, thank you so much. And here we have, you remember I mentioned El-Idrisi, the great El-Idrisi. So a lot of maps in his book. And here I chose the one that represents England. And so England is to the right, I would say 1/3 down from the frame. What he said about England is quite interesting. He said it's an island with flourishing cities, with high mountains, rivers. There's abundant fertility, but the winters are of long duration. Just to show that I think we can safely assume that El-Idrisi was indeed, in this case, talking of either personal experience or reliable reports by those informants that I mentioned. What is interesting here, and these maps, of course, you might say, well, this is all very tentative. Of course, it's tentative, but he did get a number of things quite right. So, for instance, you'll be interested to know that the towns that are mentioned, for instance, are Dover, Hastings is mentioned, Southampton is mentioned, Dorchester, Salisbury is mentioned, York, Grimsby, Boston, and Norwich, a few others as well. And even, I left that one to the last, even Durham, though it's wrongly placed on the west side of the island. But so this is an example of the kind of knowledge that geographers, travelers, scholars in general could rely on in their works. If we then go to the next slide, you remember I spoke of cosmography being another kind of subgenre in geographical literature. And here's a wonderful book by another Persian by the name of al-Qazwini. And his book was called The Wonders of Creation. And the book is this wonderful collection of geographical, historical, botanical, zoological items interspersed with the more fantastic elements of the world, at least that was thought to exist in the world. And so there are many tales about weird and wonderful creatures, as you can see in this example. There's a large number of manuscripts, and they often have different drawings. I often enjoy just leafing through these texts, looking at these wonderful drawings. If I can have the next slide, please. Thank you. So very early on, travelers, in addition to the geographers, i.e. those who intended to write geographical work, started chronicling their journeys, and these books became truly invaluable historical records, informing us not only about the places visited, but also about the travelers' homelands as they commented on this or that feature that they encountered. And here we have the first of the perhaps unusual findings. The earliest examples of Arabic travel writing deal with the non-Muslim world, i.e. with what is today Russia and China and India. Now, the Arabic word for travelogue is rihla, which means journey as well, as it still does today. And it already appears in the Qur'an in reference to the journeys, trading journeys, undertaken by the Prophet's tribe, the Quraysh. And there's a reference to the caravans in winter and summer. Now, the earliest account goes back to the mid-19th century. And the book deals with travel in East Asia. It's aptly entitled News of China and India, in Arabic, Akhbar as-Sin wal-Hind, and combines very practical as well as accurate information about various aspects of these far-flung corners of the known world, with tales that include creatures redolent of the Arabian Nights, which of course emerged in the same period. Now, the book, essentially it's two books, one that deals with the Hind, which is India, or in a very broad sense, of course, and one that deals with China. Now, the book was intended for very practical purposes, as a manual for merchants and sailors plying that route. In addition to the first descriptions of tea, porcelain, and even Confucian ethics, it provides astute and often detailed ethnographic comments, whether it be on gender relations, the toilet habits, or the treatment of Muslim traders. More importantly, the comments tend to be factual, in some cases even admiring. And this is something that is a bit of a thread in the travel literature that deals with non-Muslim territories. The foreign, and this is very significant, the foreign is worthy of interest, and it is approached in a detached rather than judgmental fashion. In some cases, there's a clear implicit contrast with the author's own society, as in, for instance, the description of the tax system, social security, or universal education in China at the time. And one can be tempted to perhaps imagine the author including these discussions as a way of perhaps inspiring his compatriots back home. Based on actual stories, or rather news reports, akhbar, by real merchants and travelers, it gives us vivid, detailed descriptions. In fact, the book is one of the earliest foreign accounts of China during the Tang Dynasty, and indeed the fullest and most detailed of its time. It's invaluable because of the detailed description of daily life in Canton, Guangzhou, the main port city in southern China during the Tang, which was the terminus of the route that started in Siraf on the Arabian Gulf, and was allegedly home to about 120,000 foreign merchants in the late 9th century. It also, of course, tells us a great deal about the outward expansion of Abbasid trade, which had an eastern slant from the beginning. It opened up a whole new world, not just geographically, but perhaps even more so, of exotic goods, not least spices, which would be dominated by Arab merchants for centuries to come. It is also to this period that we can trace the intermediary role of Arab traders between Asia and Christian Europe and beyond, as far as Scandinavia and present-day Russia. Can we have the next slide, please? And here I have included a couple of extracts. And so here we have this oldest description of tea, at least when I say oldest in Arabic, of course, oldest Arabic description of tea, which is mentioned in the book. And then the description of hygiene, or at least the perception of the hygienic nature of the people of China. Now, at first blush, you might think, well, this is a rather severe judgment, and the author is clearly disgusted with some of the things that he's writing. But if you read towards the end, he then mentions that if thieves are caught, they are put to death, which of course goes back to what I said earlier. In their descriptions, they are of course Muslims traveling abroad, and they are Muslims with their own belief systems, but they are always open-minded. And even if they discover or describe features that are at odds with their belief system, it is never in a way that is a condemnation of the people as a whole. They may not approve of certain habits, of certain traditions, but it never leads to a condemnation of the people as a whole. And this is very, very significant. And of course, religion here is also not linked. So the non-Muslim religion is not linked to any particular feature, unless, of course, it's directly relevant. Can I have the next slide, please? On the 21st of June in 921, the author of what is the oldest extant travel journal, written in Arabic, left Baghdad only to return 1 year later. And his name, as you can see here, was Ibn Fadlan. And the aim of the book was to record his observations in the land of the Turks, Khazars, Rus, Slavs, Bashkirs, and others, and news of their ways, kings, ways of living, as well as other matters. So here we have, for the first time, somebody who's writing in the first person. He's writing a travel journal, and from the beginning, he makes clear what the purpose of the book is. And he also explains the background of the journey, which is as follows. So the king of the Volga, Bulgar, had recently converted to Islam and had sent an embassy to the Caliph al-Muqtadir in Baghdad with a letter asking for a legal scholar to instruct his people in the practices of Islam, as well as funds to build a mosque and a fort to protect them from attacks by the powerful Jewish Khazars, their southern neighbors. Now, The format, you also see the map there of the various locations that Ibn Fadlan visited. The format of Ibn Fadlan's work, though it's not called a rihla, is indeed the earliest example of one, because it is, in this sense, an autobiographical form in which the author traveler experiences rather than merely reports. He becomes part of and is subject to the alien environment with each stage and progression described. What makes the work even more interesting is that it was truly original, written without any previously established model. We, the reader, experience everything alongside Ibn Fadlan, who reacts to things as and when they occurred. The style too jumps out from other literary works of the time through its simple prose style, thus making it very readable to modern readers. It's a unique first-hand historical document and the only Arabic source for many of the regions and peoples that Ibn Fadlan visited, and of course the spread of Islam in Eurasia. Russian scholars in particular have paid a great deal of attention to the text since it predates the earliest Russian sources of the area. Ibn Fadlan's account of the Oghuz Turks is one of the most detailed of its kind in classical Arabic writing. But the book is so much more than a mere travelogue, and the author is a highly discerning observer of all aspects of life of the alien peoples that he encountered, generally with great objectivity, without any real condemnation, and often with a sense of humor. He seems to have been genuinely engrossed in his journey and mission, and despite the hardships and dangers, his only complaint really was about the cold. He mentions on one occasion they had to defrost his beard several times. He tried so hard to gain an insight into the new environment despite the language barrier, which reveals itself in the systematic and detached way in which he describes all the things a modern ethnographer and anthropologist would be interested in, such as food. For instance, the fact that the Bulgar eat at the table and they don't share their food, which of course in Muslim culture is considered to be the height of rudeness. He discusses drink, dress, manners, sexual customs, laws, burial rites. In fact, every aspect of relevance to a culture and society. Of course, that is not to say that he wasn't occasionally shocked at what he saw, or realized the possible reaction to his readership of some of the things that he described. This is particularly true for his observations in the area of sexuality and religious practices. However, and this is why it's such a fascinating literature, things are never what they seem, and there's always contrast lurking around the corner. So, whereas on the one hand, the Muslim traveler is shocked by what he perceives to be unreligious behavior, on the other hand, it is precisely in those areas, so in the area of sexual mores, that his open-mindedness sometimes comes through very clearly. For instance, excuse me, while remarking on the Oghuz loose sexual morals, he adds, so the fact that partners, they can swap partners, he adds that this should not be interpreted as sexual promiscuity or tolerance of zina, adultery. Instead, he points out this is simply their culture. And in fact, many of their women, most of their women, in fact, can be as chaste as Muslim women. A decidedly moral and open-minded approach, I think we can all agree. Ibn Fadlan's travels didn't end with his trip to the Bulgar, however, and 1,000 years later, he would continue his travels as his book made an imprint on modern Western culture, both in print and in film. The author, Michael Crichton, discovered Ibn Fadlan while he was at university studying anthropology, and he was inspired by the story to write his first novel, Eaters of the Dead, which combines Ibn Fadlan's journey with events from the Anglo-Saxon epic Beowulf in the form of a narrative prompted by the discovery of a manuscript, a device also used, of course, to great effect in Umberto Eco's The Name of the Rose. But some 2 decades later, the book was turned into a Hollywood film. That was its last destination, The 13th Warrior, starring the Spanish actor Antonio Banderas as Ibn Fadlan. Can we move on to the next slide, please? Until the 19th century, the history of the rihla as a travel journey by a single author would be centered on the Hajj, the pilgrimage. And authors from North Africa and Al-Andalus, Muslim-controlled Spain, would be the main authors. The reason, of course, being that the journey for inhabitants of the western areas, al-Harb al-Islami, the western Islamic territories, was very long and eventful, and thus provided a lot of information, a lot of food, if you will, for travelogues. In addition to the pilgrimage, Muslim scholars from the Western Mediterranean were also driven by a thirst for knowledge, not to speak of prestige, the prestige to be gained from the great centers of learning of the East, Damascus, Baghdad, and of course, Cairo. The pilgrimage rihla, incidentally, is also a genre that has continued to the present day, with many pilgrims leaving accounts of their journeys, either for their personal benefit or for that of friends and families. The next slide, please. And you saw 2 names, and we'll start with the first one, which is Ibn Jubayr. So I've chosen 2 of the travelers to perhaps discuss some of the topics and themes that are under discussion today. Ibn Jubayr, from which you can see some extracts here, was from Muslim Spain, from Al-Andalus. He may be called the father of the pilgrimage rihla, in fact. The son of a public official, he rose to become secretary to the governor of Granada, al-Gharnata in Arabic, and the story is as follows. On one occasion, the ruler, as a rather cruel joke to play on this very devout man that Ibn Jubayr was, he was after all a legal scholar, he induced him to drink wine. Ibn Jubayr was so upset and traumatized by this experience that in order to expiate this sin, he decided to make the pilgrimage to Mecca, but also at the same time visit the sites of the East. And these were exciting times. This was when the great Salahuddin, Saladin to Europeans, was making a name for himself as the scourge of the Crusaders. Ibn Jubayr left Granada in February of 1183, visited Egypt, Mecca, Iraq, and Syria, returning to his homeland about 2 years later. Now, his travelogue is an invaluable source for the history of the Crusades, the state of navigation in the Mediterranean Middle Ages, the political and social condition of the countries through which he passed, the pilgrimage to Mecca at the time, and so on and so forth. However, the principal feature of his work is the description of contacts with the non-Muslim. And so this starts at the very outset, and it is in fact a Genoese ship, an Italian ship, that takes him eastward. But then again, his observations about the other, whether Muslim or non-Muslim, are also fraught with contradiction. And so his admiration of the beauties of the mythical East is often tempered by the hardship to which he, as a pilgrim, fell foul, especially in the Arabian Peninsula. And the people of the Hejaz, for instance, find little or no favor with him. On the other hand, we have the devout Muslim. And on the slide, for instance, you have some other examples where he talks about Baghdad, for instance, to which he was looking forward very much, and found that when he arrives there, it is nothing like he imagined. And so we then move to the devout Muslim traveling aspect. And he's, of course, always wary of passing too favorable a judgment on anything considered infidel. And so the reader is told, beware of entering Christian lands, and admonishing his co-religionists that there can be no excuse in the eyes of God, the eyes of Allah, for a Muslim to stay in an infidel country, save when passing through it. But then, at the same time, he expressed a clear interest in and reflection upon the foreign, the alien, and he didn't shy away from praise for the Christians, under whose reign Muslims often received kind treatment, and which he, so he explains, sometimes that treatment was better than the fate suffered by subjects of Muslim rulers. He also comments on Christian rulers' generosity to Muslims living on their territory. And so here we have, in fact, a very clear picture that emerges. His views are rooted in a contrast between the Christians as representatives of their religion and authority, and Christians as individuals. The former come in for unqualified rebuke. The latter are engaged with on a human level. One of the most moving passages in the book, for instance, is a description of a Christian wedding in Sicily, with the author being enthralled by the beauty and emotion of the event. Similarly, Ibn Jubayr reports without judgment of the Day of All Saints celebrations on board the Genoese ship that he was traveling on. So here we have an objective appreciation of the foreign and the exotic, which even extends to descriptions of monuments, whether it be the pharaonic temples in Egypt or the grandeur of the church that he saw in Palermo. Can I have the next slide, please?
I think this might be a good point for me to just interject for a moment, Daniel, if that's okay. Just to remind all our participants that we have the pleasure of listening to Professor Daniel Newman of Durham University, and he's talking to us about, his subject is Narrating the Unknown, Arabic Travel Literature. Already he's covered a wide range of issues arising from this subject. I myself am intrigued by it, no doubt our participants are as well. We've got a whole list of people from all over the world, and who I will give a shout out to once you are, once we have listened to the rest of your talk. Everyone, I'm getting some really great comments in the chat box. Do give us your questions. I already have a whole bunch of questions that I want to ask, but of course we would love to hear from you as well. So many things: the maps, the the cold. I was amused to hear about how beards were getting frozen. So much that we're all learning. So do keep your comments coming. And Daniel, just to let you know that we are approaching 3 o'clock UK time, so that should give you a sense of how much time you have left, and do carry on.
Thank you very much. Can we have the next slide, please? Thank you very much. Yes, that's the one. Now, the other name on the previous slide was, of course, that of the great Moroccan traveler Ibn Battuta, and it's very difficult to talk about travel literature and not at least mention Ibn Battuta. We're in the 14th century. His rihla, his travelogue, was based on a journey that started in 1325 and lasted almost a quarter of a century. He even crammed in 2 pilgrimages. And Ibn Battuta, of course, in that sense already stands out, but he stands out more importantly, of course, because he went where very few had gone before him, and even fewer had reported on, including China, Sumatra, what is today Sri Lanka, and the Maldives. Now, the motive for travel was ostensibly the pilgrimage and an overwhelming impulse and a long-cherished desire to visit the holy sites. And the picture that emerges here is of a traveler as a very perceptive reporter and raconteur. Indeed, both of these are combined today in Arabic, as his name, Ibn Battuta, denotes both a seasoned traveler and a fantasist. So if somebody calls you an Ibn Battuta, you'd better be careful, because they might actually be saying that you're somebody who likes to tell tall tales, or indeed to be or being an inveterate traveler. There are a number of similarities with Ibn Jubayr's accounts, but one of the main differences is the extent of the ethnographical and anthropological dimension, as Ibn Battuta observes on all aspects of life and society in the areas that he passes through, albeit once again colored by his own belief system. And if we look at the slide, for instance, we have some interesting, here he talks about China. And this is one of the few occasions where his approach becomes a little bit more narrow-minded, where he finds it impossible to go out because he's surrounded by what he believes to be unreligious and reprehensible things. But as I say, this is the exception rather than the rule, because whenever he writes along these lines, he always immediately tempers that with what are generally very praising comments about this or that feature that he's observed. Here we have, and this I chose as well, an example of the kind of detail that he provides. So this is on betel leaves, and how it's used. And so this is really a wonderful example of the kind of detail that Ibn Battuta goes to. And then the final example is where he visits Sri Lanka. This is significant because it's Sri Lanka. He was the first and only one. But also the inherent contradiction in the passage. So on the one hand, yes, the inhabitants are unbelievers, but they do praise Muslim faqirs, the Arabic word fuqaha, fuqara, meaning poor people, but also sheikhs in this particular context, and they give them shelter. But then he immediately tempers that with, they were given a meal, and the pots were brought in, and then people would sit away at a distance, and any leftovers were thrown to the dogs rather than eaten by the inhabitants. Now, one aspect of physical geography that figures very prominently in many of the Moroccan and Andalusian rihlas was water. Water, or rather the fear of it. And this is really a commonly encountered trope. Ibn Jubayr, for instance, at length discussed the state of the seasickness, to which he fell victim many, many times. And there was always a palpable sense of relief when the travelers set foot ashore. Sea travel, of course, and this is how we need to contextualize this. Sea travel was a highly dangerous occupation, and the threat of enslavement, or worse, at the hands of pirates or of shipwreck, which actually happened to Ibn Jubayr on the way home, was always there. And one of the fears of the travelers, perhaps the greatest fear, was to die alone in a distant land. And unfortunately, I kept this till the last. This happened to our poor Ibn Jubayr, who undertook a total of 3 journeys and died on his 3rd one. If we can have the next slide, please, now. Now, in the 19th century, we skip forward a number of centuries. In the 19th century, there was a huge increase in rihla works. In fact, we may call it the age of the rihla, particularly when it comes to travelogues with regard to Europe, which of course reflected the dramatic political and social changes that occurred in this period, which has been called the Nahda, or Renaissance, revival. The main factor was the intensification of contacts with Europe, in some cases, of course, resulting in very close contact in terms of occupation at home. And so 1830, we have Algeria, becomes a French colony. 1881, we have Tunisia. Egypt. So the influence and power and colonialism of Western powers, of course, really reaches a very high degree in this period. And this is reflected, of course, in the intensification of contacts. Now, as this slide shows, the numbers are quite impressive. And travelers from a variety of countries crisscrossed the Mediterranean, and towards the end of the century, even ventured as far away as the Americas. If we can have the next slide, please. Thank you. And so here, this little map shows you the various destinations in relation to the departures of the various travelers. And as you can see, it's a very interesting and very intensive travel period that we have here. Now, in terms of the purpose of travel, closer examination reveals the overwhelming importance of, once again, which is something I mentioned at the very beginning, the quest for knowledge. With educational missions to universities or libraries, other travelers went as members of embassies, and at the same time, it is also in the 19th century we first have the emergence of what we can call tourism. In fact, the Arabic word for tourism also emerged in that period. The Paris World Expositions are dealt with in no fewer than 15 works. So this, as an event, attracted possibly the highest number of travelers. And then the century also introduced another group of travelers which fall outside the mold. And these are Arab travelers, but living in French colonies. And so we have, for instance, Algerian travelers or Tunisian travelers, when their countries have already been occupied, traveling to France and writing about their trip. However, they should be treated separately because, of course, their travelogues primarily served as propaganda tools for the French authorities. But this falls outside our scope. More significantly, when and how did it begin in the 19th century? Well, the next slide gives you a clue. When did it all start? Well, July 1798, with the arrival of the French Napoleonic campaign in Egypt. Now, the campaign and the occupation only lasted for a couple of years, but nevertheless, it set in motion a series of events. Now, I don't want to overstate the significance of the French campaign to the development of society and culture in the region. And I also take great exception to the phrase that's often used, the age of decline. So the idea that before Napoleon's campaign, the Muslim world was asleep and Napoleon woke them up. I think that's a gross misrepresentation, but that too falls outside the scope of the talk. Suffice it to say that one very important element, or rather person, resulted from this campaign. And this person is shown on the next slide. And here we have this very elegant looking man. Enter this gentleman who was an Albanian mercenary commander who was part of the Ottoman army sent to oust the French, and who was able to grab power and destroy the Mamluks. And his far-reaching reforms warrant his being called the founder of modern Egypt. And it's here that the early modern rihla begins, because education was high on his agenda, and it occurred to him that rather than inviting foreigners to train his officials, he should send students to Europe. And in fact, this is what he did in 1826. He sent a group of 42 students to France. And these students, some of them were high officials, some of them were Egyptian students taken from al-Azhar. They were all allocated a field of study in different institutes in Paris, and the main fields were governance and administration, military sciences, and technological sciences. But there was one person who was earmarked for translation, and that person, of course, is Rifaa al-Tahtawi. And here you can see an Imam in Paris, which is a translation of his book, a chronicle of his time in France. He stayed until 1831, and this was the very first printed rihla in history. It had a huge impact from the time it was published. Rather than a mere travelogue, the book was viewed as a manual of modernity and introduced the author's native readership to all aspects of European culture, politics, and society. It received the official imprimatur of Muhammad Ali, and he even distributed it to both his officials and students at the new European-style schools he had founded. Not only that, the work was translated into Turkish and sent to Constantinople, where it received a very favorable response from the Sultan himself. And this book served as a model for various authors in the course of the century, writing on their experience in Europe. It was also an essential point of reference for political reformers. It's the first work in Arabic of any kind to deal with European politics in such detail, and none of this would have been known or even imagined by his readership. He even included a translation of the French Charter and a detailed discussion of parliamentary democracy and, far more contentiously, revolution against the monarch. Dangerous stuff indeed. But he was interested in everything. Trade and industry, of course, was a primary concern, and he considered these the hallmarks of a modern society, particularly the training of craftsmen and the need for creativity and innovation, something which, of course, would have been music to the ears of his patron, Muhammad Ali. The chapters on charity and healthcare are also interesting, but it is here that the Muslim world compares favorably, in that charity is a duty in Islam, and the Prophet enjoyed the need to seek knowledge, as evidenced by the hadith that I mentioned at the beginning of the talk today. The fact of living in a non-Muslim country, of course, raised significant challenges, both legally and practically, for instance, in the accessibility of halal food. Freedom of religion, the fact that people in Paris are tolerant of those who are not of their religion, was also something that impressed Rifaa. However, he immediately tempered this by saying, well, this is only because the French in general are Christians only in name. They just pretend to be Christians, so they're not really bothered about people having another religion. The character of the French he also discusses in a chapter, commenting on the hardworking nature of the French, but at the same time, their general immorality and a lack of generosity. Once again, of course, lack of generosity, one of the virtues praised very highly in Islam. When it came to European women and their virtue, opinions are generally quite divided. European women and views thereon are a constant in 19th century Arabic travel literature with regard to Europe. And most travelers were charmed by French women. They were nonetheless condemned for what were considered the loose morals and general debauchery, as well as the lack of jealousy of their men. In fact, one feature that is mentioned by al-Tahtawi, but is later on copied by others, is the fact that European women, were seen to be mistresses of their husbands. And so he quotes the famous sentence, "Paris is heaven for women, purgatory for men, and hell for horses." I guess that's still true today. One of the key areas of interest in the book are the sciences, and this is what I'm going to end with. Now, the sciences, remember, that was a driving motive of sending an educational mission to France on the part of Muhammad Ali. And so the sciences were viewed as a key component of modernity, but also, of course, military power. because Muhammad Ali had seen firsthand the military power of the French armies and also of the English armies, and he was intent on building a regional superpower. And so the book that Rifaa wrote discusses the various sciences and also impresses upon or stresses the need that they should be adopted in the lands of Islam. And this is one of the reasons, in fact, that he justifies his journey to what he called the land of the unbelievers. But this is where it becomes interesting. While Frankish, as he calls them, scholars, European scholars, French scholars, are advanced in what he called the positive sciences, he pointed out that Islamic countries distinguished themselves in the legal sciences and their application. More importantly, and this is one of the key passages in the book, to my mind, at least with regard to this aspect of the sciences, he stressed the influence of past Muslim scholars, as we can see in this next slide, the last one. And here we see that this comes as a kind of summing up of the technological and technical advances of French and European scholars. But this is Rifaa speaking. However, they, the Europeans, do acknowledge that we, the Arabs, were their teachers in all sciences and that we had an advance in them. And of course, this comes at the end of a discussion of the time of Harun al-Rashid and Ma'mun, the translation movement from Greek into Arabic, the flourishing of the sciences and so on. Intellect and observation have established that credit goes to the precursor. Is it not so that the one who comes later delves into what has been left by his predecessor and is guided by his directions? Wise words indeed. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Professor Daniel Newman, for an absolutely fascinating insight, not just into travel, but so many other aspects of medieval and Muslim life and medieval Muslim culture. I've no doubt it's a subject that you could keep us engaged with for hours and hours, and I personally could listen to it for hours and hours, but unfortunately we don't. Time is finite at this in this session. So, but what I am looking forward to, no doubt you are as well, is questions and comments from the audience, of which we have a few already. Now, before we go on to that, I do want to give a quick shout out to some of the people who have, some of the participants who have joined us today. Karen B in Normal, Illinois. Hello, Karen. Thank you for joining us. Yolande in Italy. Ivan S in all the way from Jakarta, Indonesia. Hello, Ivan. Ash is participating from Australia. Chi Huang from Washington, D.C. and Stephen from Hong Kong, to name but a few. We really hope that you enjoyed Daniel's session. I have no doubt that you did, and welcome all of you. There are some other names, but I will come to them slightly later. But I do want to get the ball rolling now and start on the Q&As. And I'm going to do that as the first question. So, Daniel, I mean, you clearly, you know, you've been this has been your specialist subject for many years now, and it's your area of research. But I'm really keen to know what kind of documentation there is on medieval Arab and Muslim culture. How did you do your research, and where do you get your sources from?
Well, the fact of the matter is that there's actually a lot of documentation. The unfortunate thing is that it's often not available in translation, but we're very fortunate to have chronicles, historical chronicles, geographical chronicles that really tell us a great deal about all aspects of society at the time. And of course, in terms of this particular subject, what I'm interested in, and where I'm very lucky, and anybody who researches the subject is very lucky on, is that we have the voices of the travelers. So it really is a question of letting the travelers speak and listening to their voice, and really immersing oneself into that journey, that world, because the journey really is a world. And so I'd like to think of it, when the journey starts, you come into the world, and then when it ends, you leave the world. So it's a kind of, it's a very much a gradual process. And the other thing that is so fascinating is that it deals with very human aspects. These are things that everybody can relate to, and that's why I think the genre is still very popular today. A modern reader will enjoy many of those works because they offer a glimpse of times past, but they're also fascinating in the way in which they inform us about society at the time, because obviously the way somebody reacts today is very different from how somebody, let's say 700, 800 years, 1,000 years would react. So there's the voice of those who traveled, and then there's also one thing that has always fascinated me is what was the view of the world, as they say in German, the Weltanschauung. What was the view of the world at the time? And this literature goes a long way towards giving you some insight into that. So it's really the gift that keeps on giving. It's something I started decades ago, and alongside my food history, the travelers, I always come back to the travelers simply because it's such a treasure trove of information and knowledge.
Treasure trove indeed. Now, we have a great question from someone who unfortunately is down as an anonymous attendee. Come on, anonymous attendee, you need to let us know who you are. Great question nonetheless. I will read it out. From your account, the Islamic scholars mostly came from high socio-economic class, so they were able to travel. What about the common men? The ruling class in both Western and Asian ancient world strongly discourages peasants from traveling. For example, European peasant needs permission from their feudal lord to travel, or ancient Chinese need permission paper to travel. What about the medieval Islamic society in restricting or not restricting travel? Also, did any women travel? Excellent question.
Yes, absolutely. Thank you so much. There's a lot in there. My word, that's a mouthful. If I may, I'd like to start with the last element of the question, women. And of course, this is a question I'm often asked. No, there are no female authors, to the best of my knowledge. The earliest female author of a travelogue is an Omani lady, but she wrote her travelogue in German. She married a German, went to Germany, and then decided to write a book about her experiences. But so in the period up until the 90s, so there is no work in Arabic that is known to have been written by a female author, which if you look at how cultural codes work is really not that surprising, but that's a story for another day. In terms of the travel, well, high economic, firstly, in terms of restrictions, the attendee rightly points out, gives examples of cultures where permission needs to be sought and so on. But of course, this overlooks the fact that we're talking about people who traveled to do the pilgrimage, the Hajj. And of course, there can be no restriction on somebody who wishes to do the Hajj. However, the element of high economic class, my word, yes, of course, because one would still have needed the amount of funds in order to be able to travel. So in that sense, it was the poor person would have been precluded, but then the poor person would have been precluded from doing many things then as now. So I don't think, and this is where perhaps I'm reading too much into the question, but there is no link to socioeconomic class per se. is the point I'm trying to make.
Well, I hope that helps, anonymous attendee. Now, at this point, I'm going to give a shout out to some of the other participants who've been joining us. Back in Edinburgh, Borat in Paris, Kamran from Jakarta, another person in Jakarta, Alan Wareham in Bolton, Theo in Norfolk, Mrs. Mohammed in Manchester, Morag in Glasgow, and Sundas also in Glasgow. Welcome to all of you, and thank you so much for joining us. Now, next question. This one is from Stephen O'Connell. Daniel, linked to your final thoughts on precursors, very interested to hear your comments on Islamic visitors to Guangzhou in China, which has, I believe, the oldest mosque in China, but also to a fascinating place I visited last year, Quanzhou, which has been described by Marco Polo back in the day as the largest in the world, and also has several mosques and Islamic buildings. What is it that led traders as far as Quanzhou? Was it purely trade or conversion or a mixture of both?
Again, a wonderful question. The presence of Muslim merchants is a very interesting topic. In fact, at the time, and there's an example in one of the slides, at the time the news of China and the Hind was compiled, the Muslim community, the size of the Muslim community was such that they even had a representative to act as a middleman between the merchants and the Chinese authorities. So that gives you some idea of the size of that community at a very early age. In terms of the reasons, I would say that trade was the primary reason. And of course, trade, especially the spices. Spices from East Asia were much prized, very expensive. And of course, they would also pick up things along the way. So trade, I would say, was the primary motive. In terms of conversion, possibly, I don't recall reading any references to somebody in that period, traveling or merchants traveling with a view to conversion. So trade is the one that jumps out at me.
Now, I would love to ask you another question. I want to just bring up a point that you mentioned during your talk, and you said that, and that is seafaring. Now, you mentioned the risk that travelers had when they were on the waters. One of the main ones being coming face to face with pirates. What do you know about the construction of the materials and, in fact, the materials that they use to travel on ships? Because I know that the Turks actually were building ships way back, in the medieval times, and they were using a particular kind of reed that still exists. Can you shed any light about the kind of materials that were used to build these ships and how seaworthy were they?
No, I'm afraid I can't speak intelligently to that point. I think they were wooden vessels of the type that were built all over the Mediterranean, and some were more seaworthy than others. But of course, the main point here was that the loss of ship and cargo, as well as one's freedom and in some cases life. And of course, it was one of those things that worked both ways. People, when talking about piracy in the Mediterranean, people always talk about the Barbary corsairs. Everybody's heard of the Barbary corsairs, which were North African pirates, and they would make these sorties and generally, make uses of themselves. But of course, it was very much like everything else in the Mediterranean, a two-way street. And so you had European vessels that would take captives, and then you would have Muslim vessels taking captives. And what is an interesting link to the travel literature is that in the later centuries, and now I'm talking about 17th and 18th centuries, there's a number of Moroccan travel accounts that are prompted by embassies in order to ransom captives. So there are people that are held in Spain, and then so they would go and try to buy them back. And of course, there would be in the other direction, there would be European embassies trying to free Christians that were held in Morocco. So the dangers were perhaps less the quality of the ship, although I'm pretty sure that also played a part, but that you could really lose all three. You lose your ship, lose your cargo, and lose your freedom in one go, because obviously the reason for taking captives was, and this is sometimes said, it was because they needed slave labor. No, the reasons for taking captives was also, of course, to be able to ransom them. So it was really a business. Think of it as kidnapping. And so this kind of happened on both sides. And incidentally, related to the slavery aspect, slaves were also moved or on the shipping route into Al-Andalus, Muslim Spain. So yes, the sea was both a friend and an enemy in many instances.
Right, well, I have some comments here that I would like to read out. Ida Gilga Baubeck says, amazing, captivating and interesting talk, thank you. Kamran Asat says, insightful presentation, Daniel, thanks. And I have a question here as well. Borat Sagdiev says, dear Daniel, at the time of Al-Andalus, why don't we have so much stories about travelers from the nearest country of Andalus, France?
That's an excellent question. I presume we're still talking about the Middle Ages. So just now I mentioned that there was travel to Spain in later centuries, so 17, 18, by the Moroccan ambassadors. Now, France does occur in the travel literature. There's one famous travelogue that describes the journey of an Andalusian Muslim who spends some time in France. In fact, he teaches one of their great Orientalists some Arabic. And there's another example of a man from Spain. We're not quite sure whether he was a Jew or a Muslim, but he traveled around Europe, including France. Now, it's indeed very limited. The reason is a very simple one. At the time, there would have been no reason for them to go there because the reasons for traveling to Spain would be sufficient. So it would only have been within the context of maybe ransoming. But so the connection with France, of course, was not that of the connection with Al-Andalus, with Spain. So, but yes, you're absolutely right. There's very few, and the ones that I've mentioned, the traveler who he also went to Italy and so on, descriptions of France are not very detailed, and the Andalusian who went to Paris to teach the Orientalists, he went to Morocco and never returned. So indeed, it's a question really of importance. There was no need, or at least they didn't see a need to travel there. This was, of course, remember, in the days before we have what can be called tourism. And remember, I mentioned the Dar al-Islam and the Dar al-Harb. In Islamic theology, of course, at the time, you would not travel freely to the Dar al-Harb or the Dar al-Kufr. You would only go if you were instructed to do so. So for ransoming slaves, that was a reason, or instructed by your ruler in order to find out how to destroy the infidel. But so that explains why France and other European countries, England is another example. The earliest books, travelogues that deal with England, also date from the 19th century.
I hope that answers your question, Borat. A comment from Nadira. If only Western schools had taught us this, when she says this, referring to all the knowledge that you've imparted on us today about medieval Arab and Muslim culture. She says the roots of Islamophobia could have been weakened. So a very pertinent point there from Nadira. Thank you very much for that. Mrs. Mohammed says, an amazing presentation. Thank you, Professor Daniel. Borat says, merci, Daniel. Yolando says, very interesting. You never stop learning new things, especially on this subject. These first trips demonstrate the first contacts that occurred before the Middle Ages and the beginning of a global world of that era and the cultural growth. So a lot of appreciation coming from our participants, Daniel, and very well deserved. I have another question here from Morag Cross. It's quite a long one, but we do still have a few minutes, so hopefully you'll be able to answer it adequately. Is there an equivalent of European Orientalism in Islamic 19th century writers and cultural attitudes? European artists painted highly imaginary, oh, this is very interesting, highly imaginary harems, hammams, etc. Did Islamic travelers and commentators pass comment on 19th century women and their morals? It strikes me that the appeal of the foreign female, the unattainable woman, might work in both directions and in both cultures. That is, for example, did Ottomans eroticize European women or French females in the same way as Victorian artists and French painters did towards depictions of Egyptian females and their private lives? Great question.
Yeah, yes, indeed. Well, there is such a thing. I mean, Orientalism has a counterfoil, which is Occidentalism. And so when I mean the question illustration, I take illustration here in a figurative sense, because there's no equivalent of Orientalist art paintings that's done by Muslim painters at the time. So there's no Arab Jerome or Ludwig Deutsch or any of these kind of Orientalist painters. But the comment is a very perceptive one, and one that I've very briefly touched upon, because the tropes that we're seeing in the course of the century, in the 19th century, the travel literature, there are definitely hints of the unattainable woman, and so the loose morals being tinged with a little bit of salaciousness. So there is definitely an element of that. Here the unattainable has an interesting dimension, because the fact that they commented on their loose morals and essentially unreligious attitudes towards sexual morality also meant the travelers, and remember, a traveler that's writing for somebody else, that somebody else is back home. And so the home readership was very much looking over the shoulder of the author. And so the author, unlike the Western traveler, the author has to be very careful in not praising this lack of morality in women, European women at the time. So that I think is a big difference But definitely the salacious dimension, I think we can see in both cases. And there are some travelers that actually refer to having succumbed to the charms of some French women. But they tended to be Christian Arabs traveling. It's another thing that I didn't mention specifically, but you remember I said Arabic travel, regardless of ethnicity, but also religion, because quite a few of the travelers were Christians, particularly from Syria, for instance, the great Francis Marash, to name but one.
Well, sadly, we are going to have to wrap up there. An hour and a half seems to have flown by, and I'm sure all of us could be chatting about this topic, all afternoon. But unfortunately, time has run out. So today's talk has been Narrating the Unknown: Arabic Travel Culture with the wonderful Professor Daniel Newman of Durham University. As a reminder, you can find out more about his work on his university bio, his Instagram page, if you want to try out some medieval recipes, and his blog. We've put them all on the chat repeatedly, so I don't think any of you will have missed out. Do take a look. You will be able to delve deeper into this incredibly fascinating subject. And on that note, a very, very big thank you to you, Daniel. It's been an absolute pleasure, and we look forward to speaking to you again in future MACFEST festivals and events. Thank you to the incredible MACFEST team, especially to CEO Sister Kaisra Shiraz, who's been listening in, Katarzyna and Hajra for their incredible work, and of course you, the audience. Your participation is what makes these events so successful. You've really ensured that it's been a very energetic and dynamic session, so thank you very much. Just a quick reminder, the festival runs until July, so please visit www.macfest.co.uk. The link is in the chat. You can download the brochure and explore all the other really exciting events that are going to be taking place over the next few months. Thank you again for joining us. Assalamu alaikum, and goodbye to you all, wherever you are.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Thank you, Shamim, for wonderful hosting. Thank you so much, everybody.
Thank you, Professor Newman. Thank you, Shamim. Before we go, thank you, Kazra. Before we go away, I just wanted to remind all UK-based Muslim artists and creatives that we have extended the deadline for the National Muslim Arts Awards. The new deadline is the 15th of July. So please head to MACFEST website, to the Arts Awards page, and submit up to 2 artworks for free. As long as they fit in one of the 4 categories: drawing, painting, calligraphy, or photography. Yes, and I hope to see at least some of you on our upcoming events. For example, Sunday 15th of June, Islamic Architecture, a World History with Eric Brogue. We also have live events. For example, on Saturday 21st of June at the Lowry, in Salford, we've got a musical event. All the events are on MACFEST Eventbrite page. Thank you very much.
Finally, I want to add my thanks. What an amazing feast again, Professor Newman. Absolutely fabulous. This is the 3rd time we've hosted you. And thank you to Shamim again, mashallah. What an amazing, wonderful hosting. Thank you to my team as well.
You're very kind. It's always a pleasure.
Oh, absolutely, thoroughly enjoyed. And all these people from around the world, thank you, massive thank you to them. And you've done a great justice by mentioning them, referring to them, keeping it really interactive. I loved it, absolutely. But before we go, Professor Newman, remind people what you're doing next year. You're going to be back 2026 with a new topic. Tell us.
Yes, I'll be talking about medieval kitchen, building a medieval kitchen and actually cooking medieval dishes in them and exploring the amazing creativity and ingenuity of the chefs in that period.
Excellent. Okay, assalamu alaikum everyone, and goodbye wherever you are. Have a wonderful weekend.
Bye everyone. Thank you for today. It's been wonderful. Take care.
Thank you everybody.
Bye-bye.